Hey, you're listening to a Bible Brodown podcast, a member of the Trinity Commission. This is where brothers come together to sharpen one another so we can rightly divide the Word of God. I'm Matt.
And this is Billy.
And today we got a discussion, just me and Billy, talking about the debate. So you already have an episode of me interviewing Braxton. That was late at night after the debate. And it was, it was like, I think we ended at midnight. And that was really just to get Braxton's feel for how it went. I wanted to get, fresh afterwards what he thought was good, bad about it. And largely it was all good, but now that we've had a week or two to stew on it, Billy, you've listened to it at least once. I've listened to it a second time.
Yeah, I did too.
So we're going to just talk through what we thought. And really, I want to hear what you thought, Billy, because they already got some of my opinions. But where do you want to start?
Yeah, we got some of your opinion. We're going to talk a little bit about the debate and some things that we can pull from that. Some of the tactics used by Braxton and really Matt, and not MD. Should I call him MD? That sounds strange. Matt Dillahunty. I'll just call him Dillahunty.
Yeah, Dillahunty first.
But yeah, so before we get into like the actual discussion, I've listened to the debate twice. I've listened to obviously your interview with Braxton. I listened to Leighton's interview with Braxton. I've read Braxton's article that he posted on Free Thinking Ministries. I've read a lot of the YouTube comments, which are just terrible. Have you read any of those?
As YouTube comments are, yeah.
And then I've read some Facebook posts regarding it and such. But so what we didn't get to see from any of the interview or anything like that is what was the environment like? You were there in person. This was the Super Bowl, according to Braxton. So what was the environment like?
So I got there early, and I walked in with Leighton, and when we got there, it was really just Dillahunty and one other guy with him. And so I got to kind of see it evolve from just talking, chatting, light conversation with those two, to slowly people started trickling in. And largely, I think it was a theist crowd. I think at one point you can hear Braxton ask the crowd who has had some kind of religious experience or some kind of experience with God. I don't remember how he worded it, but I would say 80% or more of the room raised their hand. So it was very much a theist crowd, but you did have some people, non-believers or some skeptics in there that were came up at the end and asked questions. And you could really tell at the end, because you experienced this at the free will debate. At the end, what happens after the debate is you have a group of people surge up to meet one side and a surge of people come up to talk to the other. And there's another 30 minutes of discussions that go on that isn't recorded because it's just individuals talking to these people. And I would say there was probably, 15 or 20 skeptics I assume they're skeptics because they went to Matt Dillahunty immediately and were talking to him and going back and forth. They could have been challenging him. I don't know. I didn't listen to those conversations, but overall it was a very pleasant atmosphere. I mean, it was in a chapel. It was a nice setting, a nice debate. And the whole discussion was not really, there were no attacks. There wasn't like the free will debate where I was kind of blown away by the whole deal. It was really what I expected, a professional debate. It was good.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think recalling the Leighton and Jonathan debate with Sonny and Zachariades. I remember afterwards, it was just like that. But eventually it got to where the people started intermingling and having their own little mini debates. At least that's how it was at that one. Did that happen?
See, it wasn't that one because it had that mixer afterwards where we went into another room and there were cookies and stuff out. And that was another hour at least of talking.
Yeah, when people have food in front of them, they kind of forget about everything else.
Yeah, this wasn't like that. There were, almost immediately a bunch of people just bailed out. And then the ones that remained, the ones that were talking to Matt were talking to him, and the ones that were talking to Braxton were talking to him. And then that was it. It just kind of dissolved after that. Dillahunty did an interview with Eric Hernandez and then headed out because he had to drive back.
Mm-hmm.
So there wasn't a debate after the debate like that one was, really. Mm-hmm. The free will one was. But it was good. I liked it.
What about, did Braxton seem nervous before the debate?
I didn't talk to him before the debate, actually. So I got there. I got to Waco at 2, 3, something like that, and I messaged Leighton and Braxton on Marco Polo, and they had just gotten back from lunch, and Braxton had basically stopped responding to Marco Polos, and I knew he was in the zone. He'd been working all day on this stuff. He was very, very prepared, but he just wasn't talking to anybody. And so Leighton and I ended up going to get dinner, and then went over to the debate, and the debate started. I think it started at 6. I didn't see Braxton until 5:45. Like, he came in right at last 15 minutes. I just went over and said hi, gave him a hug, and then that was it. I didn't talk to him. I didn't really. He seemed very professional and prepared, but I couldn't give you any.
Like, the eye of the tiger.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. He was in the zone.
Mm-hmm.
That's exactly it.
Well, for the audience, I talked to Braxton after the fact, or even before. I don't remember, but I asked him. I said, "So, when you factor all the hours that you did this and how many days, what do you guesstimate what you spent on preparing for this? How many hours?" And he said probably about 600 to 650 hours that he spent preparing for this. And for those of you, that's like a master's degree, right? It's like 2 to 3 years of college credits. And that's what he did
definitely.
For the what amounted to 2 hours. But obviously that was less than half of that was him talking. So I mean, that's a pretty large ratio. So I've told Braxton that he needs to get more bang for his buck with this debate, whether that means publish something, do more videos, more podcasts, but he needs to get more bang for his buck.
Well, I think he will. I mean, he's already published the article on the free will argument, and we'll talk about that argument in a minute. And he is, I mean, he'll use all this information. I think it's funny, though, that this was a classic example of hope for the best, prepare for the worst. And he certainly prepared for the worst, but did not get it.
Right.
And he did not. Yeah, he could have done this debate a year ago, like next day notice kind of thing, and still done fine.
Right.
Which is,
with my
whatever.
job, we have this questionnaire, and it has all of these leg questions where if somebody responds yes, it'll open up like this giant tree of other questions, right? And Braxton basically went through every possibility, every scenario within the debate to do that, but he only covered probably 5% of what he was ready for,
Maybe.
Right? Because he didn't get asked questions, it didn't get led to that. So yeah, it's there. I would love if they could have just like had a whole day of just back and forth. The speed and the shortness of these debates, you don't really. It becomes very surfacey.
I feel like we need to reiterate our position on debates. We don't think that if the goal is just to get up and argue, that's pointless. In this case, this was an evangelical kind of. I mean, this was him reaching out to atheists and skeptics, trying to give the best argument possible. And obviously, that's a witness that we want those things to happen. Same with, I know people give James White a hard time about like his debates and talks with Muslims. Dude, they're hearing the gospel, so that's good. Like, I don't care that he's debating them and talking to them and being nice to them. I mean, we're supposed to love our brothers and love our neighbors as ourselves. So obviously, that's cool. And then, but I agree with you on as far as the debate format. The reason that the format is really good is demonstrated in the free will debate with Leighton and Jonathan and the other two, because it just got it was some nonsense from the other side. In this debate, because they were so cordial and really they matched each other's energy as far as how abrasive they were, which they weren't really at all, and also just how well they spoke to the audience. I really would have preferred a discussion type thing, similar to, if anybody's watched William Lane Craig talked to Lawrence Krauss. There were 3 different talks in different cities, and it was just a lot more content, a lot more discussion, and they had a kind of a focus, but it was just back and forth. It wasn't a formal debate. I would have liked to have seen that with this, because you're right. There's so many different ways this could have gone, and it did feel very abbreviated. It was pretty fast overall.
Yeah. All right, so let's get into the main. So the debate, for those of you who don't know, is, does the Christian God exist? And generally speaking, it's one takes an affirmative, one takes a negative, like yes and no, right? And it really wasn't like that, and we're going to get into that right in their both openings. I mean, Braxton, right in the beginning, he said, he's defending the proposition that the Christian God exists. He made that plain right in his opening, right from the beginning, and he says, I'm going to give 2 arguments for God's existence and 1 case for the resurrection of Jesus, right? So setting kind of that boundary that, yes, a God exists, and the resurrection is evidence that the Christian God exists. And that's how he went into his initial argument. But again, he had a proposition, and he provided evidence for that. And we'll get to what Matt Dillahunty did when we get to his section. But do you remember the 3 arguments, Matt?
Yeah. I do think before I get into those, it's interesting that I don't know that there's another way to do this debate than what Braxton did. I mean, you could kind of change up which arguments for God you wanted to use. Free will argument obviously is kind of original to Braxton. You could use the moral argument. Poor connection. Switch to audio. No, I will not do that. Sorry. Technical difficulties. Hopefully this keeps working. What was I saying? Oh, so he could have picked any argument he wanted for does a God exist or does a supernatural being exist? But that wasn't the debate. It was does the Christian God exist? And so he had to do something specifically Christian. Now, there's only a couple of arguments that he could have gone down. One is defending the Bible and what it says. One is more specifically defending the historicity of Christ. And that's the route he went because that is the single giant supernatural event that defines Christianity, which is Jesus came, he died, he rose again, and that's what kicked off the church.
Right.
So, I don't. He did it perfectly. I mean, this is the only kind of format I see that would have worked really well to defend that.
Right. And for those of you who are interested, Braxton and Jonathan went to Wisconsin and did an apologetic conference, and in that they did Braxton's core facts, and they had an hour session specifically on the reliability of Scripture and the resurrection. So if you want to get like more in-depth answers to what Braxton said in his short 20-minute opener, you can go look that up or email us and we'll send you a link to the video.
You can also go to his website. I think he has tons of stuff there.
Yeah. So he went. Go ahead.
You asked me what the arguments were. The first one's the free will argument, and then he followed it up with the Kalam argument, a bigger argument that started with the Kalam, and then the resurrection case for Jesus.
Right. So free will argument, if God does not exist, then libertarian freedom does not exist. Libertarian freedom does exist, therefore God exists. A lot of the YouTube comments I saw relating to this were basically assertions. He's asserting that libertarian free will exists.
Yeah, so I have a love-hate relationship with this argument. And this isn't to belittle what Braxton has done. Right. I think it's a clever argument. And for the most part, you have types of beliefs called properly basic beliefs. And philosophically, those are ones that you don't really argue, that they just are accepted as fact. And people live their lives believing that they have a will and that they're doing one thing that they could have done otherwise.
Right.
That's a properly basic belief. And so this argument on a lay level is very convenient because someone's just going to accept, free will. And in saying libertarian freedom, you're going to have to define that. I think if you're just having a conversation with someone, you could say, if God does not exist, then free will doesn't exist. Free will exists, therefore God exists. It's fine to lower it down. And if they argue that, then you could use higher language, so to speak.
Right.
But I think for your average layperson, it's fine. They're going to say, okay, so free will does exist. Does that mean God exists?
Right.
And they'll have to think through that.
That's really what the foundation of this argument is. It kind of goes back with the moral argument, where if you're setting the expectation that most of your audience believes in objective morality or libertarian free will, and if that is the case, then those that hold those, right, you can set this argument. You may have to defend how libertarian free will, points to God's existence, right? In which what you do when they start asking the question, well, how I believe in libertarian free will, but how does that mean God exists? And you can go into the arguments there. But if people just reject the premise that libertarian free will exists or objective morality exists, you have to defend that, and in order to really make your argument. So it becomes I'm the same way with the argument. Love-hate relationship.
And let me tell you the 2 reasons why I'm not sure I'd use this in a lot of situations. The first one is Braxton is too nice, and he will admit that, as I know there's a soterio ban, but it's a soteriology ban from them talking about it, not us talking about them talking about it. So he will say that the Calvinist idea of determinism or compatibilism is incorrect. He doesn't agree with that. And when I asked him, is there a possibility that they're correct? He admits that he can't say for certain that they're definitely wrong. There is a possibility that they're correct. And so to me, that's just if you can't say for certain that the idea of compatibilism or determinism in Christianity is wrong, then you're admitting, well, libertarian free will might not exist, but that doesn't really threaten the conclusion, therefore God exists. But it kind of throws a whole kink into the argument in the first place. If libertarian freedom doesn't exist, well, okay, well then I just won't use this argument, right? That idea messes it up for me. I don't like the Kalam is much more solid to me, and it is I can reason through it and hit all the points without any cracks in it, and that just feels like a crack to me. It's maybe just a personal, like I said, it doesn't invalidate the existence of God to say that libertarian free will does not exist,
right?
But yeah, that's one of my problems.
He's saying to have libertarian free will, you need to have a being that gave us libertarian free will. All right, but it doesn't follow because you don't have it doesn't mean that there's not a being controlling all things. Yeah.
Well, and so that's the second problem is it's hard to that's debatable. I mean, there's a really solid case for if free will requires God, but still that's a point that people will debate. Just because libertarian freedom exists doesn't mean God is the only explanation for it. Now, they may just have to appeal to mystery and say, I don't know what could be the motivation for it, or the what allows freedom in a person to exist, but I don't have to assume it's God. And they may just leave it at that, which we'll get into what we were going to talk about in a little bit about the what is it called? Nuh-uh-ism? What? Not atheism. Lactheism. Yeah, it's not that they are against God; they just lack the belief in it.
He's a lactheist.
Yeah.
Yeah. But what you said just a second ago about a plausible, I don't have to assume, right? And we're going to get into that about Matt Dillahunty's idea of plausibility, right? What is the most likely, right? And many of his most likelies, he would rather say, I don't know, than provide a plausible explanation. And we'll get into that later, but remember that. So yeah, that's a free will argument, and then he goes into the Kalam argument, and he starts that as with the premise, and then adds on to that. That's and for those who don't know the Kalam, Matt,
the Kalam is there are different forms, which Braxton called Matt Dillahunty out on in the debate, but they generally go. Anything that begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist, therefore the universe had a cause. And no, it does not mention God in the
itself.
Propositions or the conclusion, right? It doesn't say God anywhere. But as soon as you conclude that the universe had a cause, you have to then ask yourself, what are the qualities of that cause that put it outside of the universe in the first place, and what are these? What could it possibly be?
Yeah, he said everything has a cause. Everything that begins to exist has a cause, and he said there's zero examples of the opposite, something beginning without a cause, and I think there's a lot of zero examples of Christian
of things we know exist.
Yeah, of things that we believe. We have zero examples to see, right? So I don't think that's a very good, insert, right? Zero examples of the opposite. The universe consists of time, space, and matter, began to exist, and therefore has a cause. The argument stems that the cause must be outside of time, space, and matter, and be an agent with a will, and God is the best explanation of that. Braxton said, nature did not come before nature to cause nature. And he also threw
Yeah.
in, and he also threw in the infinite regress as part of this argument as well.
Well, really, that's how I've used it recently elsewhere, is that if you say, because that's all it is, this argument is to refute an infinite regress of causal events, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if you explain to someone, you cannot have an infinite regress back in time of contingent events, these things that were caused by something else, because then you can never reach the present. You have no jumping off point. No matter if there's a beginning somewhere back there, which if you're saying it's infinite, there isn't, then there's no matter how much time has passed, you can never reach the present, which will either thoroughly confuse them or they'll understand what you're saying, and they'll accept the fact that you can't have it.
Yeah,
but then you immediately have to say, you end up to the same conclusion as the Kalam, which is what was before that first contingent event? What kicked off the whole domino chain?
Right. Right, and that goes against determinism, right? Because they would say something naturally deterministic, right, couldn't have caused something like this. Some interesting YouTube comments. People have not thought through about the infinite regress. Like somebody said, well, just because we have an infinite past doesn't mean you can't get to the number 9, right? And for those of you who are trying to follow this argument, right? And, to get to the number 9, when do you start? You start an infinite way back to 0, right? And there's an infinite amount back to 0.
Well, they're talking about that's that. What they're talking about is you can divide mathematically, even between 0 and 1. You can divide 1 in half, and you get 0.5, and you can divide that in half and get 0.25. And you can divide that infinitely over and over and over. However, between 1 and 9, if you're counting whole numbers, there's 9 of them.
Right.
So that's not an infinite. You're not traversing it.
Right. But I'm saying is that there's that infinite space kind of thing.
Right.
It's just not understanding. You never can go back to a starting point in order to reach any point that you're trying to reach on the timeline, so to speak. But anyway, he used the Kalam, the free will argument, and those were his two cases for God exists. And I thought the Kalam was good. Many people, I know in the debate and in comments that I read said, the Kalam's been refuted, blah blah blah, etc. I don't know why they still use this old stuff that's been refuted.
It's YouTube warriors. It hasn't been refuted because everything that begins to exist has a cause. That's what they're talking about. Probably is like stuff that Lawrence Krauss says, where prior to the universe, the Big Bang, there were quantum fields that were fluctuating, and in these fields, we don't understand it well enough, but they would argue that a particle and it can come in and out of existence in these quantum fields, and so it is basically, think about a black box and where you don't know what's inside it, but it is perfectly random, and so it spits out these outputs that are completely random, and that's what these quantum fields would be. It's just this completely perfectly random black box, so there's no causation at all, but it can just spit stuff out. And the problem with that is, if it could do it once, then it could do it, a billion million, infinitely after that. So we would have just a constant explosion of universes. Like the idea that we are the product of some completely random black box just doesn't work, because we would observe that. It's I don't know. That's what they're referring to.
Right. But it goes back to, aren't quantum fields part of our universe?
Right. Well, yeah, and they would try to say no, not in the way that like time, space, and matter is, because those don't apply to these quantum fields, and but we would say those are matter. Mm-hmm. That's matter. Right. Yeah. So if you have, and that goes back into Kalam and what we were talking about. If you have a first cause, what we say is an ontologically necessary first cause. We need this first cause to kick the first domino. If we have that, then it can't be the same stuff as the domino. It can't be time, space, or matter. And the only thing that fits that is some kind of spiritual something, right? And Braxton calls it a mind. And he argues that it must be some kind of spiritual mind because, again, what you said, that there wasn't anything that caused it to act. This spiritual mind had to act of its own free will because there wasn't anything preceding it to cause it to create the universe.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah.
And the last argument he used was the resurrection of Jesus. Again, we'd encourage you to go to his webpage and look up all the arguments for the resurrection of Jesus. And we can just put that out there now. Basically, Matt Dillahunty, in one of the first cross-examinations, basically Braxton said, do you have any argument or refutation or anything like that of the resurrection? And he basically said no. So basically they just didn't talk about that at all.
Well, Dillahunty did mention that there was the case of, let's say there's a person who has their head cut off, clearly dead. Nobody survives with it. Only chickens can run around with their heads cut off. But no, a person has their head cut off, and then they bury him, and all of a sudden the next day this person comes walking around, head back on, not dead anymore. And that's his way of saying, here's another example of what would be what we would call a resurrection. Could he conclude that person was healed by God? He said, no, I have no reason to jump to that conclusion. I could only say that person was dead and is alive again, but I don't know how that happened.
Right.
So that was like his one jab at the resurrection, but he didn't bother to attack it historically. He didn't bother to address most of the arguments that Braxton actually presented in that 10-minute section that he gave.
Right. Yeah, half of his opening statement was on the resurrection.
Yep.
All right. So, any concluding thoughts just on his opening?
No, I thought he did good.
He did.
I thought it was great.
I think it did. I don't know how to say this nicely. It did seem very.
Billy Prime, go.
It did seem like very over the top. I know Braxton was trying to win the audience, and I know he was trying to add in humor and.
Are you talking about the dad jokes?
It's just like he was very. Oh, how do I say this? Like that slick guy on TV.
You're saying he sounded like a televangelist?
Kind of, yeah.
He sounded like a preacher, man.
Right.
He was.
And I noticed this when I was at the Wisconsin when he was teaching. He reminded me very much of all those old Southern Baptist people I grew up with that preached. I enjoy that, but in a debate, people who associate that kind of demeanor with churchy people, right? And they are they have that resistant, right? Many of the YouTube people say he was like a car salesman, and I can see that, that would put off some people in that approach. Now, you have to. I don't know if he could find a line in between, humor and being serious and all that. I guess that would be like William Lane Craig's approach. I mean, William Lane Craig is pretty serious and.
I don't know that I've ever heard William Lane Craig crack a joke.
Yeah,
I'll be honest.
Right.
But I think Braxton has what we all have to an extent, which is a stage voice. Heather makes fun of mine kind of mercilessly, and he does that. But the thing is, like, you'll hear mine come out when I'm at work or when I'm presenting to a group of doctors or whoever I'm talking to. Mm-hmm. More so than maybe in this setting because we're used to just talking at a microphone now. But that's his job. Like being a seminary president and being an evangelist, like that's his whole job. So when he gets up on stage, that's his game face. And yeah, it's going to sound way different than him just, chatting with people on Facebook or, linguistically or talking to us on Marco Polo. It's just going to sound different because it's not casual anymore. He's
and that's what I think I think would connect more with people is that approach, like that casual. I mean, Matt Dillahunty has that down pat, right? He's definitely done a lot of these, and I think that's something true. And yeah, my wife always tells me she says, "Oh, you just switched into teacher mode," and right, my voice changes, my demeanor changes, how I hold myself changes. It doesn't come off in this any longer for sure. All right. So going to Matt Dillahunty's statements. I'm gonna before we get to his 2 lines of argument, which aren't really arguments or evidences, but they're arguments. I want to mention some things that he said in his opening before he even gets to these.
Okay.
He said arguments for the Christian God should not also work for other religions. That's one of the statements he made.
Oh, sorry. Excuse me. You weren't done.
And I think the point is that you have to establish that a God exists first, right? And those arguments could be applied to any religion.
Right. If this debate was, does the Christian God exist, and Braxton did not give a case for the resurrection, that point would have landed.
Right.
But when you use 2 arguments for a supernatural, ontologically necessary being, and you couple it with a historical event that proves Christianity, that's good.
Yeah.
He completely was not talking to Braxton in that comment.
Right. Yep. He also made the statement he was not in the debate to disprove God.
Mm-hmm.
So nowhere actually did he actually tell us why he was in the debate. Nowhere.
Well,
he
I
told
think
us why
if you
he
listen
wasn't
to him,
there.
right?
But he nowhere made any kind of assertion. He said his position is not that he is convinced there is a God, and for some gods, he is convinced that they don't exist. But he wouldn't say that regarding a God in general or the Christian God. He's convinced that there are some that don't exist, maybe Zeus or something. But his position is that he's not convinced that there is a God.
Right, and this boils down to burden of proof. And what he is saying is that the burden of proof is on the person making the positive assertion.
Mm-hmm.
If I'm saying that there is a God, I have to be able to provide reasonable evidence to show that there is that being, that he exists somewhere out there, that he needs to exist. And Braxton gave a really strong one and then a supporting one. I think the Kalam is a slam dunk. There has to be this ontologically necessary being. You cannot philosophically get around this. And if you hate philosophy and you're like, only science, then that's a philosophy of yours, that philosophy shouldn't exist. Like, that's completely self-refuting. So philosophy is good, and we can understand things from it. And I think we can understand things certainly. There has to be an ontologically necessary being that kicked off creation.
See,
that is without question.
That goes back to that's an assertion that there has to be an ontologically necessary being. Now,
but I have reason to it.
What?
It's not an assertion; it's a conclusion to an argument, and they have to show where that argument fails.
Right, and what he mentions, we're going to get. So hold that.
Okay.
Necessitates ontological being. He said he's no longer convinced that Christianity is true. All right, so he once did, now he doesn't. He says, how can we judge single occurrences, especially with historic events? Okay, whoop-de-doo. But this is where we kind of get into this. There has to be. We must build the most plausible case we can. And what's interesting is, how do we define plausible? He never says what's plausible. He kind of does later, because he starts saying, giving his own measuring sticks. How can we look around the world and look to see if a particular religion is plausible? We can look at what we know. And he says we need some how do you say this word? Methodology? Yes. I feel like Leighton. That when consistently applied, manages to confirm one hypothesis and not others. So that's his thing, is that, so we can hypothesize that, yeah, the universe has to have a cause. What that cause is the thing that's kind of up for debate, right? And the Christians or other people who believe in, theism would say that it's plausible that this, eternal being is the one that caused all this. He would say he would never be able to point to that because he can't test it, and it's a one-time event.
Right. Yeah, Braxton had a good comeback on that. The idea that you can't test, or that a one-time event somehow disqualifies it from being reasonable is silly, because the universe coming into existence was a singular event. Like, right. Are we assuming that didn't happen? That's just I mean,
he's looking for a scientific way, and it's interesting because he basically says that you can't judge history either, which, I mean, then he's just left with nothing for how we got here and why is he even debating it.
I mean, I'm a fan of science. It is a great tool that we've used to tremendous benefit for the entire world. It's a means of observing reality around us and drawing conclusions from what we've observed. But the problem is it's not equipped. That method of understanding, which really that's all it is. Science is a method. It's not a thing. It doesn't draw conclusions. It helps us draw conclusions by structuring the way we analyze things, events. So it is not equipped. That method is not equipped for understanding stuff outside of this universe. It does not apply to spiritual things because it's not a spiritual method. Like it's not. So can it reason to God? I mean, it can show us that it only gets us so far, and then we have this point where we're like, yeah, no, nothing makes sense anymore because the scientific method is specific for, again, the nature around us, and not a metaphysical stuff that we can't see or touch or smell or hear.
Or test, right? Yeah, science
exactly.
tends to have a hypothesis and then tests it, and you can't test many things like history and things like that. But we still have, I mean, you look at court, personal testimony is evidence, historical events are evidence, philosophy can be evidence, all these things can be evidence, and he is basically throwing many of those out the door. One of the things he says before he gets into his arguments, well, one thing about these things, his statements, is basically he said he wants God to make him believe with the evidence that he wants. He doesn't say that, but that's basically what you include. He wants God to make him believe with the evidence that Dillahunty wants. Right.
He said that if God exists, he would know what evidence would make Matt believe, and that's what he expects to show up. But he will never quantify that. He won't tell us what exactly that is, which leads me to believe if maybe in his mind there is no evidence that would actually cause him to exist or to like believe, and so he's asking God to do the impossible because he's already put this goal so high that it's, there is no actual evidence sufficient.
Basically, he wants to use his own measuring stick, and with the measuring stick he always has a way out. Because any evidence like that you provide hypotheticals, he always has a way out of that example that you provide, that hypothetical. And he can't provide us... Go ahead.
Well, that takes us back to what we were talking about, though, with the Kalam. You have this being who needs to exist in order to kick off creation, the universe. So if we provide this argument, this philosophically certain, I think it's one of the few things I would say is definitely certain. This certain argument, then okay, burden of proof is completed. I've given you an argument for why this being has to exist. Now you have to respond back. The burden of proof is now on you to show how is this wrong? How is this argument failing in some way? That's on you to explain to me. Because right now the logic looks sound. It looks valid. Yeah, disprove it.
That goes back to logic and philosophical arguments. When you provide what is or seems to be a philosophically sound argument, a rational argument, basically what he said is, well, I don't know and I can't test that, instead of trying to make the argument invalid. He just says, I don't know and I can't test that.
Right, which seems like this is the same experience I've had elsewhere. I got this person to the point where they were saying, yes, okay, I agree. There must be some ontologically necessary being out there that had to start the universe. We can't have an infinite regress of events. And I would say, okay, based on that, let's talk about whether or not this being, and a being can be a chair, a being can be, your ceiling fan. Look right there. A being can be a person. So a being is not a personal agent. But I wanted to move from, you admit this being exists. Let's talk about the fact that it has to be a personal agent. It had to be free to make something. It couldn't be a perfectly random black box. And he would go, but I'm not certain of that, so I'm not going to agree with it. And I was like, you're basically just closing your eyes. I didn't say this, but he's basically just closing his eyes to the conclusion that he just came to, which is, yes, that being has to exist. but no, I'm not certain, so I'm not gonna even, tolerate that argument. That's
right. So with all of the, if you think about Matt, with all the supernatural miracles in Scripture, did those make people believe? Did anyone who saw a miracle in Scripture believe?
Did anyone or did everyone?
Did everyone? There we go.
Yeah, I was like, yeah, some of them did.
Yeah.
No, definitely not. I mean, you get the Exodus. We love going to that. You have all these miracles that happen. He's feeding these people after they leave all the miracles in Egypt. He feeds them. He clothes them. He provides water for them. He splits a sea for them. And then they get out there and they're like, oh, I don't want to be out here. It's hot, and I want to go back to Egypt. And God, punishes them for it. They didn't believe. They weren't faithful. Even if they believed, like the demons believe, they did not. They weren't aligned with Him. They didn't pledge their allegiance to Him.
Right. Yeah. Our fathers in Egypt did not understand your wonders. They did not remember your abundant kindness, but rebelled by the sea at the Red Sea. Nevertheless, He saved them for the sake of His name, that He might make His power known. I think that's He did it to make it known, but just because it's known doesn't mean people accept it or take what they know and do something with it.
Exactly. I mean, you do have people like Paul who had a heavenly vision and he obeyed it, but he had the freedom not to, because he specifically says he obeyed the heavenvenly vision. Mm-hmm. That implies to not obey it, I think.
He says, I did not prove disobedient to the heavenly vision to King Agrippa.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So Matt Dillahunty did make arguments, though, right? I mean, he had a couple that he snuck into this tornado of an opening.
Yeah. So he said, so here's my 2 lines of argument, and they're not going to disprove God. Which is, and they're not going to. Yeah, they're not going to. He said they're not going to disprove God. They are difficult to overcome if you are convinced Christianity is true. And the first one was divine hiddenness, and basically it boils down to, if God wants us to know He exists and what He wants from us, then there are certain things we would expect to see. And that's when Dillahunty advocates using the scientific model in order to see those things.
And again, the scientific model helps us understand our physical universe around us. Philosophy helps us understand the need for God. You can't have theology without philosophy, right, Billy?
Right.
Yeah, so philosophy is involved in understanding God. That's just without debate. But if God wants us to know He exists and what He wants from us, then there are certain things He would expect to see. We would expect to see. That's what Dillahunty said.
Mm-hmm.
Romans 1 is screaming in my head. Right? I mean, this is universal witness stuff. This is our wheelhouse.
Right.
He has made it evident to us. What does He expect? That we honor Him and give Him thanks. Like, everybody knows that. He's put the law in our hearts so we could see His mercy and we could be humbled to Him. Like, He does that.
Right. Right. So yeah, he basically has his own measuring stick and thinks that God is going to naturally use the measuring stick that He wants, or the measuring stick everyone wants on the planet. And he said a lot of things like, He wants us to know He exists. There's certain things He would expect, but He never actually gives what we would expect to see. He makes the assertion that we would expect to see things, but He doesn't give. He throws out the hypothetical. I mean, right now in the middle of this, debate, Jesus could just appear on here, and then later on somebody mentions that, and would you believe that? Well, no, I would conclude that there's somebody here, but I wouldn't necessarily conclude that it's God.
Right. I mean, this isn't really divine hiddenness. This is Dillahunty hiddenness.
Right.
This is we don't actually know what the standard is, and I don't think there is a standard actually. I think Matt, and I'm not questioning his sincerity when he was a Christian. Billy and I believe someone can be sincerely following Christ, can be sincerely seeking God, and then turn from that. They can suppress the truth in their own righteousness. They can harden their heart against it. And so I'm not questioning his experiences in the past or his sincerity when he was pursuing God. But I would say now he has closed himself off to the possibility of God to the extent that there is no sufficient evidence that can be given.
And this one a lot to me, the divine hiddenness argument, and even the next one, I think, both are just like Braxton's first argument with the libertarian free will. The assumption that libertarian free will exists, or in this instance, the assumption that God would do certain things for everyone in order for them, right? And his assumption is what those certain things are, which he doesn't actually give us any things of what those are. He's appealing to those people in the audience, like, well, yeah, I want this evidence, and if I don't see this evidence, then divine hiddenness is true.
Right. His whole statement here begs the question. I mean, if God wants us to know He exists and what He wants from us, then there are certain things we would expect to see. It's begging the question because He's assuming in it that we haven't seen those things. We have, and the line that we have to draw is the distinction between what Dillahunty and what skeptics think is reasonable or sufficient evidence,
right,
and what God thinks is reasonable or sufficient evidence. And God says He's given sufficient evidence. And we've even argued that to some He gives more based on their circumstances, a la the not Allah, but the you know what I'm saying, the Muslims who are seeing dreams of Isa and going to missionaries and saying, "Who is this guy? Tell us about it. We want to, we want to follow him."
Right.
I don't need that, but they did, so God gave it to them. Sufficient.
And maybe that goes into his second argument, which he really never, ever, ever explains, because I actually just re-listened to this right before this episode, and I was trying to figure out what in the world he meant by this, and he never really explains it, which is inconsistent revelations. Again, I don't know if he was trying to say that people have different revelations and their evidences aren't the same, or I have no idea what he was trying to get at all from this.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, different people have different revelations, different people have different experiences, but so here's an example, Billy. Let's say we're at your small group. Let's say you won the lottery, and at your small group, you have 5 families sitting around. In one family, you give a check for $8,000. In the next family, you give a check for $2,000. In the next family, you give a check for $100. And then next, on different amounts to each one. Okay. And they're going to look at that and say, this is a different amount. Like, why would you give one more to one and more to the other? And from their perspective, you gave an inconsistent amount.
Okay.
And then from your perspective, you can explain, my goal was to get your bank account up to $10,000. Some of you had more, some of you had less. I wanted to make it even across all of them, so I gave you the appropriate amount to make sure y'all were even. I'm unbiased. So from your perspective, it's completely fair. From theirs, they may not understand. I think that's what God is doing, is He's making sure that the sufficiency that He expects, that His witness is going to reach, He's going to make sure and balance the field for everybody, make sure they have that sufficient.
Oh, I lost you again. There you are.
Right there. I got a call, and it paused us.
Yeah.
Okay,
so another way to look at that, you could say, you mentioned, give 100 and 500 and 10,000, all that stuff, is that, let's say the minimum that we in that group is 100. Well, in order to buy what I want you to buy, you only need 10. So everyone, all the people I gave, have the sufficient amount to purchase what I want them to purchase.
Yeah. Yeah, that's probably a good way to do it, because you think about people who have more light given, right?
Are going to be judged harshly, right?
Exactly.
Right, but they all have the sufficient amount in order to do what I want them to do.
Sounds like the parable of the talents, really. He gives 1 to one, 10 to another, 50 to another, and they go out, and what do they do with them? They're judged based on what they did with it.
Now, he tied these two together. Again, they were very, very vague. And he said these two together talk about the reasonableness of non-belief. So now he's telling why he's justifiably a non-believer. That's what he was arguing. These are justifiable reasons to not believe. And that's when he says, I'm sincerely convinced that there's no God. And then he said most God propositions are unfalsifiable.
Yeah, and unfalsifiable. So people get hung up on this. Even Braxton's guilty of this. Just because something is unfalsifiable does not mean it's not true.
Right.
In fact,
his own position.
In the statement "I am" or that I exist, like one of the most basic beliefs you could possibly have is that you exist. You have zero way of falsifying that. Like I can't somehow prove that I don't exist. That doesn't mean I don't. Just because it's unfalsifiable doesn't mean it's not true.
Right. And Matt's position, Dillahunty's position was like, I have not hardened myself to a point where I will not take any evidence. Right. That's a position that's an assertion he's making, or a position, whatever you want to say, an argument he's making is that I've not reached a point where I will be, nothing would convince me. That's an unfalsifiable position. Until you actually change, that's unfalsifiable.
Yeah, and I think William Lane Craig, actually, if you go back a couple months ago in his Reasonable Faith podcast, just 15, 20 minutes, he actually has a whole episode on unfalsifiable claims, and does something being unfalsifiable mean that it is therefore false? No. God being one of them. Can you falsify God? The thing is, with truth, there are some truths that by virtue of the fact that they are true, you will not find any way to prove that it's false. I know it's kind of a word mess, but I'd like to have a whole mini-cast on unfalsifiability and examples.
How many things do we hold true, even in science, that are unfalsifiable?
Right. That's exactly. And I want to think through that, but that would be a good mini, I think.
Right. So he's not convinced there's no God. He talks about it's reasonable for him to be a non-believer, and that's the reasonableness is because he hasn't had enough evidence to prove God's existence. He said basically he goes into this rant about like different religions, and as a believer, he always looked at other religions and pointed out to the errors of those, and then he took that same skepticism and finally applied it to his own religion. He said the objections launched by me are the same ones launched by you and others about other religions as well. I try to be consistent. There's a methodology that's presented that's going to lead me to consistently plausible, reasonable positions, and I'm going to go with that. I've yet to find one that points to any God, let alone the Christian God.
And again, I mean, I don't see how he's getting around the I don't think he understood Braxton's argument. I will say that. I don't think he understood the idea that you can't have an infinite regress of contingent events, so something had to start it. What was that being? Mm-hmm. And then Braxton hit it a home run when he explained that why it had to be a personal, free will agent. So if you're saying that you refuse to accept that, kind of the discussion's over, because you're not going to grapple with that argument. You're not going to show how it's false, but you're just going to refuse to take it into consideration. I don't know.
Right. This is an interesting statement that he made too. If there is a God, he should have a great understanding of logic and reasoning, of the nature of evidence, of what should and should not be convincing and compelling to people. If that God exists, where is he? And if all of this is true, that there is a God and he has a nature and he understands evidence and he knows what is convincing and compelling, then why is there ever a debate of his existence? To him, he's basically saying, since I don't believe, then God doesn't exist.
Yeah, or because there's even a question of his existence, he doesn't exist.
Right.
Right. And I get what he's trying to say, or what he is saying. I understand his point, but he is making some assumptions that God intends for everybody to have. What does Jesus say? That blessed are those who see and believe, or blessed are those who don't see and yet believe. There is something that God is looking for with this particular creation that we're in this particular state. As unfortunate as it is, he wants fidelity without completely revealing himself to everybody in a way that would completely overrule their freedom to choose, right? We know that God could, if he wanted to, appear to every single person and force them to believe. It would just overwrite their free will, kind of like he hardened Pharaoh beyond what Pharaoh was willing to harden himself. We know God has that ability. So he is this divine hiddenness. It's not really a problem. It's a tool that he is using to make sure that people are actually free to choose. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Right.
How else would you say that?
You can go back to the whole like torture idea, that everyone has a breaking point, right? Where I can get a person to say what it is that I want them to say. And what's strange is that you can do that, but still you have not necessarily won the heart of the person. All you've done is force them to do something that you want them to do, but that doesn't still change the fact that they still didn't want to do it, and there's nothing behind that. There's all sorts of people in the world today who know things but still don't act on those things. There's also things that you look at various evidences that we would say are empirical, but yet people still deny them. And so in fact, to me, that shows that it points to another like idea of free will, that you can have empirical evidence that everyone is aware of, yet people can still choose to claim unbelief.
And I think if you have, and the way we've argued the universal witness, it's done by the Holy Spirit. This is the power that God uses to convict everybody, and so that's the consistent thread as this what Scripture calls the still, quiet voice. If you're hearing that, and He knows you're hearing it because He knows your heart, if you're hearing that and you reject it, and then you go off and say, there's no evidence out there. I mean, that's the standard, really, is He's expecting you to submit to this conviction that He's placed in you. And if you're going to reject that, He's not going to give you more light. He has no reason. You're saying, I don't want to be your child. And He's not going to provide you with more evidence. However, if you are groping for Him, then He says He's not far off from anybody.
Right. And
He will give you more light. So it is almost ironic that a person who just refuses to believe says, but and I'm demanding evidence. Like, that's not how that works. That's not the relationship that God is looking for. If you humble yourself, if you submit to Him and you cry out, then He will. And we've experienced this. We know that other Christian believers have experienced this, but an atheist can't expect to experience it because they're just shutting themselves off from that option.
Right. Yeah. It also, I think there's a lot of assumption that he should have a great understanding of logic and reasoning, and we would absolutely agree with you. And he should understand the nature of evidence, and we absolutely agree with you. And according to, you mentioned earlier, Romans 1, right? The truth of God is evident within them. Why does Romans 1 say it's evident within them? Because God made it evident to them. Mm-hmm. So it goes back to, I don't have enough evidence. Well, the judge says you do have enough evidence. So at the court, can I say, as if I'm in a court and there's a judge and all this evidence is placed against me on the crime, just me saying it's not enough evidence mean that it's not enough evidence? No, it's up to the judge, right? That's the decision. And
especially an omniscient judge who knows right. your heart. Like, right. Again, different people are going to get different levels of this, or different amounts of light, different amounts of witness based on their situation. He knows that, and He knows how they're responding. So you can't lie to God.
Right.
No.
He ended his opening with he being God has to do something better than presenting a story that's been altered, passed on in languages that have died out, etc. So that's basically his straw man at the end of all we have is a story that's been altered and passed on in different languages that died out.
You know, it's interesting. The Sola Scriptura guys would probably want to fight that more. Mm-hmm. But I'm fine with agreeing with that to an extent because He has. Yeah, God has done that. So fine, yeah, it has to be better than the Bible. The Bible is awesome, but God has done, so much more, and I'm fine with that.
Absolutely.
And I will say I'm not admitting to the type of alterations that your average atheist would say has happened in the Bible, but I think Dillahunty later on in the debate, again, go listen to the debate.
Yeah.
Dillahunty does admit, no, most of the alterations are like spelling mistakes and things like that. It's not massive theological changes.
Right. Yeah. He did. He tried to. It's funny because he kind of threw that ball out there like it's not reliable, but then Braxton gave up all this evidence, and then he agreed with Braxton. He's like, well, yeah, it it means what it means. He tried to. Yep. I think he threw in one curve. Like there's a few questionable things in there though. Okay.
And that was probably his kind of dig at slavery and some of the stuff that he takes issue with. Some of the possible contradictions in the Gospels, things like that. But even those, when you understand the genre of the Gospels and things, they're not hard to understand.
Right. Do we want to go into the next thing, the mini?
The lack theist or the beliefs?
Lack theist and beliefs, because that's all kind of tied together.
Yeah. Come back for the mini, and we'll talk about what the different. We'll talk about
Dillahunty
someone who made Dillahunty mad.
Yeah, he was smart in how he approached this, and what's interesting, this argument has actually been given by an atheist on what to do to take this approach, because it leaves them basically kind of with this get out of jail free card, so to speak, get out of debate free card, and we're going to see during the mini. That if we were to take this position and turn it around for the theist, then it puts the burden of proof on them. So it's interesting. This has been pointed out on Facebook through like Jonathan and some other people. There's a video that we'll mention next week about that you can go watch on lack theism.
Cool. So yeah, come back Thursday for that. We do have, we're in the midst of pulling together this slavery study. It's big. Billy has seen the spreadsheet that I sent him, and it's big. But we'll get that together, and hopefully next week we can do that. But life is a little crazy, so we'll see. Maybe the week after. But yeah, any announcements? Anything we need to talk about?
For those of you who've noticed on the YouTube video, we have a different format. We're still working.
A different logo.
Yeah, still working. Yeah, different logo, different format. Still working on how exactly we want to do the video. Matt really needs to find a new camera because it never focuses.
It's my phone. It's Blame Galaxy. I wonder if I could download. Now that I think about it, I need to download a different phone. No, that won't work because this is Skype. I don't know.
Yeah.
I just it's dumb.
Yeah, now we have both of us on here at the same time. We got our logo. You know who we are. Our website kind of thing. Eventually we may get into some other things on this, where we hide this part and pull up a website that we're looking at or whatever, which is pretty easy to do.
Right.
And what else with this? Oh yeah, we do want to thank Sierra, who is the one that provided the logo.
Yes, great job.
Yeah, it's fantastic. We're very happy with it. And in the future, we're going to have a link to a website that will enable you to purchase T-shirts and shirts and hats and cups. I don't know if this is going to be. I don't know. It's probably going to be for cost, I think. I don't know how it works.
Yeah, I don't. Our goal isn't to make money off of this stuff, right. But if you enjoy the Brodown and you just want to support the logo, we want to give you some stuff that we put together that is quote unquote official. So once we have that and figure out how all of it works, we'll share the links and talk about it on that episode.
Yeah. All right. Go listen to our friends, Trinity Commission, Trinity Radio, Soteriology 101, The Narrow Path. You should, if you're interested in a seminary, you should go check out Trinity Seminary, trinity.sem.edu.
TrinitySem.edu.
TrinitySem.edu. There it is.
There you go.
And if you have any questions, you can look up Jonathan Pritchett or Braxton Hunter at their Trinity website and email them and find out how you can take classes, whether it's an audit class or looking for a degree or whatever.
And I think that's it.
All right. Till next time.
God bless.
God bless.